morning. This is Jim Lucan of Jim Lucan Outdoors, and it's the first week in June 2025. And I'm out here in beautiful Little River Inlet. It's a Monday. Luckily, all the crowds have gone away. This place can be horribly crowded on the weekend, but I'm out here on a Monday, and it's very pleasant. And I thought today, while the tide's still going out and I'm waiting for an incoming tide, to talk a little bit about float rigs. Now, float rigs are used all over very commonly here in Little River. But today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the nuances of using float rigs and how you can use different floats, different rigs to target flounder, red drum, and sometimes even spotted sea trout. So let me show you a few things here. Now we're going to start with the tried and true, and I'll talk a little bit about where and how you might want to use this particular modification of the float rig. This is a popper cork, and all of these float rigs I'm using, I have them set up as slip bobbers so you can adjust the depth, which is really important using these float rigs. This one is kind of a standard one used for red drum because it's got this little cup at the top, and when you jerk it, it makes a popping sound, kind of like that. Hopefully you can hear that. And that's good for red drum, but it's good for red drum in non-crowded, kind of low-pressure areas. And I'll talk a little bit about this sound issue in just a second. So, standard sort of float rig. The way I rig these things is I put a barrel swivel below it with a couple beads just for fun. And then there's a leader, probably about a foot long, and then I put something at the end of this leader down here. Now, the something I put down here depends on what you're fishing for, current, depth, and things like that. One of the most common things that I use under these slip bobbers is to tie a jig head. And the jig head, the nice thing about a jig head like this is, of course, they come in different weights. And so you can change the weight of the jig head depending on how deep you want that bait to go. And also, let me just say that I fish these slip bobbers primarily with mud minnows. If I can catch mullet, I'll put them under here. And sometimes even shrimp if I can get them also. So on this particular rig, I have a place where I know there's some big red drum, and so I'll use this sort of standard one. I'll have a leader here under the barrel swivel of about a foot or a foot and a half, and then because these red drum tend to be a little bit deeper in some of these situations, I've got a 1/4 ounce jig head under here. I'll hook a mud minnow or shrimp or something under this, and simply throw it out there and let it float with the tide. Now, that rig right there, and also I've got some 15, 20 pound test under here because there's a big red drum out here, and you need something that's going to be able to handle them. So that's kind of the standard approach that we use out here. We'll call that number one standard approach. All right, number two approach. Now, number two approach is when you're not so interested in making noise with the popper. For example, when you're targeting flounder in somewhat shallow water. And let me just say, this noise issue is something that many fishermen don't give enough credit to, particularly in places like this where there's so many boats, so many people. Boats making noise, people running wide open around here. I guarantee you in this intercoastal waterway here, fish avoid a lot of human activity. And so I think you need to understand that with these float rigs, sometimes noise is not good. Sometimes quiet and stealthy is the better approach. And so when that is the situation, I'll use one of these bobbers. These are these little Billy Boy bobbers. It's got no cup on the end. It floats, but it doesn't make any noise, so you can toss that thing out into the water, and It makes no noise whatsoever. Same general idea, barrel swivel underneath it, about a foot, foot and a half of leader. And in this particular instance, if I'm targeting flounder, I'll probably go with a 1/8 jig head, because I don't really need to be going that deep. Sometimes I'm fishing this rig in a foot and a half, 2 feet of water, and so you want that jig to be light. You don't want it to be down in the oyster shells where it's going to get hooked. And so I'll go with a 1/8 ounce jig head, again tipped with either a mud minnow or a shrimp or some other kind of bait. So that's primarily what you might go with if you're trying to be quiet and stealthy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about size of these bobbers here in just a second. All right, number 3. So this is the rig you will use when you really want to be quiet and stealthy. I found these things on Amazon, and they're called Thick Fish, THK Fish. And I really kind of like these when you're really fishing in some shallow water and you're trying to be really quiet, really stealthy. There goes a boat. Multiply that sound by about 1,000 on the weekend and you'll understand what it's like out here. Back to these things. Get the biggest ones you can get. This is a 4.1 inch one. Rigged pretty much the same thing. Rigged as a slip bobber under a barrel swivel with a little 1/8 ounce jig head at the bottom. The thing about these Thick Fish bobbers is they are super sensitive. I mean, I can tell, you know, when something's biting on these things, when it's looking at them, they slide really easily. Don't mess with the smaller ones because they don't have enough buoyancy. Go with the big ones, the 4.1 inch ones. These particular bobbers, you know, sometimes you don't have to worry so much about a red drum. When a red drum takes one of these things, it's gone. But with a flounder, sometimes they nibble it, sometimes they just take it, go back to the bottom, sometimes they'll take it sideways. You never know what a flounder is gonna do when they bite on one of these slip bobbers. This particular bobber lets you know everything that's happening down there on the end of your line. So I use these in really shallow situations where I'm trying to be very, very quiet and stealthy. I can set this thing so you know, it's essentially floating that mud minnow down there about a foot or a foot and a half, and these are interesting in certain situations. All right, a couple of final points. The bobber stop, I don't think it matters that much. I'll use string. I'll use these little beads that slide on. I can actually make these things myself. That's not really a big issue. However, how easily this slides up and down your line is a big issue. And so make sure whatever bobber you're using matches the width of the line you're using. You don't want it to hang up. You want that thing to slide absolutely freely, so the minute that thing hits the water, your bait's down there in the zone. And so make sure you've got the bobber that matches the diameter of your line, and make sure this is sliding very easily. All right, enough about rigs and lines and floats or whatever. How do you fish these things? Well, it just depends. If you fish inshore areas, you're always dealing with some kind of current. The nice thing about a float rig, or the main advantage of a float rig, of course, is that it keeps this bait just off the bottom. I used to throw these jigs a lot, just bare with a gulp bait or something like that, and I was always getting hung up on the bottom because you're usually fishing around Spartina, you're usually fishing around oyster beds, and you're constantly getting hung up if you're trying to hop this thing across the bottom. And let me just say, if you're trying to do that, the lighter the better. 1/4 ounce isn't going to work, although I can put a 1/4 ounce jig on a float rig and get by with that. So the advantage of these float rigs is you can precisely present a bait to fish in a variety of situations, but mostly you're not really casting this all the time. You're just putting it in the water and let it drift either along a Spartina bank, over an oyster bed, across a deep drop-off, just about any situation where you need to present a bait across a long or a lot of expansive fishing territory. So the major advantage of these float rigs, number one, it keeps you from getting snagged on the bottom. It allows you to cover a lot of ground, and it allows a very precise presentation of a bait, usually something tipped onto a jig, a live bait, a shrimp, or something like that, down near the bottom where many fish are hanging out. All right, let's talk a little bit about where you might want to fish these float rigs. And let me just give you a little tip. Coming out to a fishing site at low tide is probably the most valuable thing you can do to learn where to fish. This is a bank along the Intracoastal Waterway here, and I'm just going to move the camera along there, and you can see places like that one right there, where it's just pretty much of a nothing section of bank, nothing but pretty much you know, sand and a few shells and a couple of rocks. Not good, but if you move a little bit farther, see that area along there? Look at that eroded, almost vertical line of Spartina along there. That's where fish are going to be hiding. That's where they're going to be hanging out. And so when you come back at high tide, those are the places where it's good to sort of float a bait up against those walls like that. That low tide scouting outside, it holds for banks like that are eroded, where you can find these vertical drop-offs. It also holds in places like the Intracoastal Waterway here, where at low tide you can find these little places where there's rock, where there's old oyster beds, where there's old construction debris. Over there is a good example. You probably can't see it. There's an even better example over there up against the golf course over there. At low tide, you can see things that really give you good insight for later on at high tide. So don't overlook and don't forget to come out to your favorite fishing spot and check things out at low tide. Shoot, I even come out here with my camera because I'm old and I forget. I'll come out here with my camera and I'll photograph these places and print them out, and I'll have a little folder of photographs. So at high tide, I'll remember where the good places are to fish. So let me summarize here. Float rigs, great way to present a bait, a mud minnow, a shrimp, a mullet, or whatever. Float rigs, use floats that match your target. You can get away with those loud popping floats if you're targeting big red drum, and you know, they work really well. But if you're in a heavily pressured, noisy place where people have been pounding these fish every hour and boats are running all over the place, don't forget that fish get shy of things like that. And you got to be careful. You got to pay attention to how much noise you're making in the boat. You got to pay attention to how much noise you're making in your presentation. And it's my opinion that some of these float rigs allow you to get a bait in front of fish and not spook them and make a lot of noise, because I think in some of these heavily pressured areas, being stealthy, being silent is just as important as choosing the right rig. So, hope this is helpful as you head out this summer 2025 and use these float rigs to try and catch some inshore fish. Be safe and enjoy your fishing. And as always, when I'm fishing, most of my fishing is catch and release. I'll occasionally catch a flounder because, well, who doesn't like to occasionally eat a flounder? Almost all the fish I catch, that includes when I take clients out, it's catch and release fishing, because let me just say, Our fish are under heavy pressure, and we need to do everything we can to preserve and conserve the populations. So, have a good summer. This is Jim Lucan from Jim Lucan Outdoors. All right, so just to sort of give you a little background here, got this little creek mouth here, and I know there's a shoal up there really shallow, so I took this float rig and ran it. All right, here we are again. Had a little problem getting him off, but he just took that float rig, he just pulled it down and held it down. I didn't even know whether there's a fish there. We'll measure him. I don't think he's 16. Oh, he's 15 and a half. So he's going back to get bigger.